you win, I lose, or I win and you lose. It's like we don't have a mentality now that we can both have some success.
There will be fewer and fewer jobs that a robot cannot do better. What to do about mass unemployment? This is going to be a massive social challenge.
Are you afraid of robots? Seriously, are you? I mean, probably not, right? If you're a teenager, definitely not. You probably love the idea. If you're a scientist or inventor or doctor, same thing. The technology revolution has given you staggering new ways to do things in your work people could hardly dream of a generation ago, though we still don't have flying cars, but still. But what if you're a machinist? What if your trade's been on the assembly line in Detroit for the last 20 years? You still love all that technology when your job has been actually taken by a robot? What if I told you that every 1 in 2 jobs today out there will soon be taken over by a robot? But not mine. Hi, I'm Ian Bremmer, and welcome to GZERO World. Today, it's all about the job and how automation is redefining work as we know it. I'll get into it with a man from the heart of America's Rustbelt, Ohio Governor John Kasich. And of course, I've got your puppet regime. But first, a word from the folks who help us keep the lights on. Technological change isn't new. The first guy to join 2 wheels together took food off the table of the neighborhood muscle men. Henry Ford separated the horse from the buggy. The Luddites, an old group of British radicals, destroyed cotton mills they saw as threatening. Those in their ivory towers might call this short-sighted. After all, technology kills some work on the front end, but other work is created later on. Goodbye, factory workers. Hello, computer programmers. That's positive, right? But tell that to the guy whose job just got nixed. Thing is, it's hardly ever framed that way. Instead of work disappearing to machines, jobs supposedly pack up and leave. Yes, some manufacturing jobs have left for China or Mexico, but most of them were just automated. That's an estimated 80% of the jobs that have been lost in the United States in recent years. And the revolution is just getting started. Nearly every major American city will see half its current jobs replaced by robots in 2035. That's according to the Institute for Spatial Economic Analysis. Think about that for a moment. If that study is accurate, every other job you see today, a robot will soon be capable of doing. 3D printers for home builders, factory workers, and chip makers, and artificial intelligence is expected to replace workers in the offices of doctors and lawyers, schools, and universities. There'd better be some way for those people to earn a living. Inevitably, there'll be winners and losers. If you've got cash, you've got a better shot at adapting. Poor regions and developing countries will have it much harder. Why? In rich countries, kids are usually accustomed to the tech tools and training that prepare them for tomorrow. But for many developing countries, access to the latest technology and a decent education risk them falling behind. Now, in the past, there's been a pattern that still worked in their favor. Take China. Last century, lots of people traveled from the countryside to cities to look for jobs. They arrived ready to work, but with no power to demand high wages. The sudden surge of workers caught the eye of manufacturers. New factories opened, word spread, and more workers showed up. Then, something interesting happened. Those workers started to gain bargaining power. They could demand higher wages and better working and living conditions, and a middle class emerged. This story has played out again and again all over the world. But what happens in a world where the factory boss would rather have a no-wage robot than a low-wage worker? Where do the jobs go? And what if government can't help because it doesn't have the money to spend on helping large numbers of people make that transition? what happens to them then? That's exactly what America, Europe, and Canada and other wealthy countries are facing. Think voters are angry now? Wait till there is no work and government has no answers.
So crazy. It's just nuts.
The fact that he thought that no one else could do it.
Oh, he said he got in there by himself. And
Yeah.
So you guys will talk?
Yeah, it's kind of fun. Get to watch a game, you know, that kind of thing.
Governor John Kasich is a household name well outside his home state of Ohio. Few have had a closer policy view of how automation can affect a workforce. Now, here's the rest of my conversation with former Republican presidential candidate John Kasich. Governor John Kasich, delighted to be with you.
Thank you.
Who do you think is experiencing the greater crisis of short-termism? Is it corporate America today, or is it Washington, D.C.?
I think it's both of them. Now, no, there's great companies out there that say we have to look for the long term. I think, if you think about Warren Buffett, I think he's a long-term investor. So I'm not condemning all of corporate America. I'm saying that corporate America needs to look at itself. That's why you now have this growing movement called inclusive capitalism.
Right.
Because when we take a look in and we see the divisions between rich and poor, we see a great divide. That's an issue for our country. And so I think the more that companies can think about what they can do to participate in lifting everyone in the country, and I'm not saying they ought to be, they ought to be, sort of social, what do I say? So, people who are involved in social work. That's not what I'm saying, but I believe they have a responsibility. And I think there are more and more CEOs that believe that it's very important for them to participate in what kinds of things? Job training, dramatically improving education, particularly in the K through 12 level, where it's really very, very wanting. There are things that you can do to reclaim a neighborhood. I have a guy I know who's in the long-term care business who's been out there trying to rebuild Ferguson. It doesn't mean their profits go down. It means their profits do go up, but at the same time, they're contributing. So in Washington, of course, it's
so like you think the CEOs you actually think are starting to move in the right direction on this?
Some are, yes. Others are just focused on the bottom line.
So in Washington?
In Washington, it's all about the next election. So I don't have a chance to really do the kind of things. That's kind of some of what I see down there. The attitude of I got to respond to my base. I have to look over my shoulder, and if I alienate my base, I might not win. Oh my goodness, I may have to lose my seat at the 50-yard line of the football game. I don't know, and I don't want to be. I really don't want to be belittling. I don't want to really belittle these people. I just know that I think they can do so much better, these politicians.
Jeff Flake, Senator, Republican, not running again, said that if he were running for re-election, there's no way he could have called for an FBI investigation of the Kavanaugh accusations. That speaks to a system that feels a little broken.
Well, maybe he was being honest about his circumstance. I can't tell you the answer to that, but what I can say in regard to me, and you have to remember, I'm not running for anything. Or
2 terms, governor, that's it.
So, I'm sort of, in a way, free to say a lot of things because I'm not running again. But nevertheless, throughout my career, I was never a predictable person. For most of my career, people were trying to put me in a box.
So tell me about you. If you were running right now, tell me something that you can say that you would find it much more challenging to say if you were actually running for re-election.
I don't know what that would be because I don't think I'd be changing my game plan. I don't think I'd be saying, well, I have to be easier on Trump. What I believe, as I've advised a newly elected congressman, is when you agree with him, then fine. But where you disagree with him, let people know.
What do you believe that the Americans stand for today? Not in principle.
I think
not in principle.
Yeah,
not enshrined in the Constitution.
I think there are a number of people who think this. We've been doing all this stuff for the world forever, and it's time for us to put America first. Okay.
I've heard that someplace before.
And sometimes we have to do more, and that may not be the best example, or somebody who's wealthy who does more and more for their family than what others do. And sometimes the spouse says, why do we have to do that? Well, to whom much is given, much is expected. And in our country, that Robert Kagan piece that appeared in the New York Times about the responsibility in many respects of the United States to maintain the world order, to prevent the aggression based on land and based on economics to try to keep the worldwide peace. This is a big responsibility for America. So if all of a sudden we go away, what's left? Again, we have a vacuum. So, you know, the Chinese are running all over the world, and they're basically buying off politicians in these countries. You know, they're investing all over the place. I don't know how long China can put up with this and just pass out all this money, but that's what they're doing, and they're gaining influence. And when you think about some of the places in Central America or South America or even in Africa where they're giving away the next generation's wealth in raw minerals that now they have to give to the Chinese, it's pretty amazing, right? So, you know, America needs to be strong, and we need to be a leader. And I hope, you know, in my lifetime, we're not going to stop that.
I mean, I wonder, do you think that we can do that in the way that we have historically? China's a lot bigger. The transatlantic relationship is more strained. Europe is much more divided. The Russians are much more willing to antagonize us. The average American, many of them do feel the way you suggested, why are we doing this? They weren't around. They're not the greatest
I think when they're
generation.
reminded, though, Ian, I think when they're reminded, they get it.
But do you think, I mean, clearly it's a heavier lift than it was historically. Do you really believe that we could articulate that the same way we did after World War II, or the same way we did during the Cold War? Do you really believe it can be the same?
Well, nothing is ever going to be the same.
Mm-hmm.
Things that are the same status quo over time doesn't work.
Then how does it change? How does American leadership need to change, in your view, from what it was?
I think it gets to be about upgrading the way in which we probably approach the rest of the world, to listen more to some of these leaders and what their real problems are, I think our whole foreign aid and agency for international development operations are obsolete. They don't work. Americans don't want our money to be sent somewhere where it enriches a handful of people or destroys the environment or disrupts the environment. I think there's ways, and is a good example of this, and I was involved early on, was the example of the debt relief that I involved myself with Bono. It was a whole different thing, PEPFAR in Africa. Mm-hmm. The reason I always thought that the United States should be involved in helping Africa is it was some self-interest too. When the B-2 bombers fly over Alaskan Village and people are yelling and screaming about Americans, are ugly, a lot of the people in the village will come out and say, no, but they vaccinated my kid. So I think there's a way for us to still be effective, to be a leader, not be a sap, not be some stooge for somebody, but yet to look at these institutions that are not functioning very well, to have the courage to change the way in which we do things so that we can be more effective. Now, the perfect example of this is what happened with Brexit. You had this institution that was not responding. They were not reforming. They were heavy. They were yesterday's news.
The institution, in this case, being the European Union?
Yeah, the EU. Mm-hmm. And what they do in Brussels, and and the high tea time, and it's so yesterday.
Now the Brits should be all about high tea, John, to be fair.
Well, yes, but good point. They that's a good point. But also a good stiff drink every once in a while. But what I'm trying to say is that these institutions didn't want to change. These international bureaucrats, they have the nice life, They're not staying at the Holiday Inn. They're staying at the Four Seasons. And no, but it's the rules and the regulations. And what I'm saying is these institutions need to be modernized. And if you take, for example, the problem with drugs that we have in the country, for us not to have a strategic program, both an economic and a security program to deal with the problems in Central America, where the flow of drugs is coming, what do we think? We're going to get all these drugs caught at the border, or we're going to get them all caught interdicting them between the states? Why are we not more involved in the region? And now, you just don't go running in there. Colombia, at one point, you saw the good results we got out of Colombia. Now it's maybe going backwards today.
Now there's a lot
okay, but
more
it is. So you just
yeah.
have to constantly be working. But for the good of the people in our country, we need to have a foreign policy that's different, that's effective in that part of the world. And if leaders don't want to work with us, then there's not much we can do. But there are leaders that if we approach them the right way, I think we can make some significant progress. So I think we need to look at the way in which we do all of this. I think that the Western world has a big problem with cybersecurity. It would be just wonderful if we could get together with all of our friends and say, let's come up with a cybersecurity strategy. You have to do your thing, we have to do our thing, but let's work together. The issue of terrorism. When we think about many of the attacks that we saw in Europe, it was because the countries couldn't work with one another. And what about us? And how do we get them to work together? That's called leadership. I think in those areas we could have done much better.
Should we be promoting our democratic values?
Absolutely.
Internationally?
Absolutely.
And how should we do that?
Well, we had, Radio Free Europe in the old days. I mean, I think now we have, obviously, talk about the old days, we now need to get into the 21st century in terms of the ways in which we can communicate what our values are. And our values are basically the freedom of the individual, we know what they are. They're the basic values about human dignity. And do I think that we can promote those? The answer is yes. And we need to think about ways to more effectively do it. I don't think we do this really through the barrel of a gun. I've never really favored our involvement in civil wars directly. I don't think that makes sense.
There are those who say that you are considering a run for the presidency in 2020. Now, I mean, I know you're now an empty nester. You've got some twins that are now outside of the house, so clearly you need something to do. Is the president...
My wife has a long list of things that I could do without having to run for president, but I hear you.
This is something that you are actively thinking about?
Sure. I mean, if I can figure out a way to help the country, and it may be that helping the country doesn't even mean that I need to be a candidate. I don't know. All options are on the table. I mean, I could, the option of being a Republican and running in a primary. But I don't want to do something that is not going to be impactful and positive. And I don't know where that's going to take us, because trying to predict politics in America today and what might be the most effective things to do to impact our country would be like predicting the weather in New York a month from now. It's just too hard to do.
It's going to be colder.
So here's the...
No, I'm pretty sure of that.
Here's the issue. Snow, rain, sleet.
No, I can't say that. But it's going to be colder.
But
it's a broad sweeping.
The question is there a way for me to do that in a positive way without having to be a candidate? I'm not afraid to run, but I'm also not afraid not to run.
Why do you think the Republican Party has shifted to become a party that you have a hard time recognizing or reconciling your values with?
Well, I think that we wear red and blue uniforms. I mean, the same thing with the Democrats as with the Republicans. Whoever the leaders are, they're the ones that kind of define it. And then those who are in that party try to decide, okay, am I signing up for this? And I like to say that when people are like Presbyterian and Republican, and sometimes I think they'd rather give up being a Presbyterian than give up being a Republican. Same thing holds true for the Democrats. So it's just it's a tribal thought. And Ian, one of the biggest problems we have, I think, in the country today, and not just in politics, but it is a principle of a zero-sum game. In other words, you win, I lose, or I win and you lose. It's like we don't have a mentality now that we can both have some success, that I don't have to destroy you in order to be a winner, that I can win by giving you some part of what a victory would be for you.
Governor John Kasich, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Nathan, and my question today concerning geopolitics is based on missile defense. Are we really safe when North Korea finally hits that nuclear button?
Well, Nathan, if it's a nuclear button like we had on Puppet Regime, then we're probably okay because it wasn't connected to anything. But if it's a real nuclear button and someone were to press it, no, it's kind of a bad thing, right? I mean, look, we don't generally want nuclear weapons to be in the hands of totalitarian leaders who could be overthrown at any point, especially because not only may they not hit that button themselves, but What happens to those nuclear weapons if the regime falls apart? Who ensures that the generals that control them are going to maintain some level of responsibility, accountability, or even that they'll continue to control them? They won't get sold, they won't get dismantled, and the material will get moved around. It's clearly a bad thing for the world that North Korea now has probably some 30 nuclear weapons. But I'm less concerned about North Korea today than I was even a year ago, not only because the Americans and North Koreans are planning for a second summit between Trump and Kim Jong-un, but also because there's a lot of diplomatic engagement between Pyongyang and Seoul, Pyongyang and Beijing, which means that even if US-North Korean negotiations don't work, you have lots of folks in the region that are trying to keep tensions relatively low. So it would be a disaster if Kim Jong-un presses the nuclear button, but I don't think we're going to have to answer that question.
What's our administration's latest stance on Putin's involvement in the conflict in the Ukraine?
Oh, Maria, it's kind of a war. I mean, the Russians have taken a significant piece of Ukrainian territory, some of which, Crimea, used to belong to Russia, was given as a gift under Stalin, and is occupied mostly by Russians and almost all Russian speakers. They largely wanted to be a part of Russia, and they were an autonomous unit even when Ukraine was independent. But a big piece of Ukraine, southeast Ukraine, has now been informally occupied by what we call little green men. The Russians say they're independent. In reality, a lot of them are former Russian fighters and Russian citizens, and Ukraine has lost a big piece of their territory. Their economy is falling apart. They've needed support from the IMF. They've also faced enormous number of attacks, cyber attacks, for example, information warfare, and the rest from the Russians. Big problem is that not many people outside Ukraine really care. The Europeans have never wanted to give them much aid when Ukraine wanted to be a part of the European Union. The Germans and others said, no, we've got our own problems with like Greece and Cyprus. The Americans are sending them some humanitarian aid, now sending them some defensive weapons like anti-tank Javelin missiles. At the end of the day, the Americans don't want Ukraine in NATO. They're not going to do all that much. So like in Syria, the Russians have been able to have mostly their way in their backyard. Ukraine is really corrupt. The economic development is limited, but certainly the Russians shouldn't be in their country. This is a frozen conflict. We've seen a lot of these in the former Soviet territory. It's not going to get fixed for the Ukrainians or for the Russians, frankly, anytime soon.
دولة الرئيس سعد جالس يومين في السعودية فأرجو ما تطلع إشاعات إنه مخطوف.
Next up at the GZERO Comedy Basement, an immensely talented young man from a quaint seaside town called Jeddah. Please welcome to the stage, put your hands together, everybody. It's the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mr. Mohammed bin Salman.
Thank you, Shukran, thank you. So, wow, it has been a weird month, huh? Just real weird. I mean, take my wife, for example. All of them. No, I'm kidding. I only have one. I have one wife. I'm modern, right? Yeah, I'm modernizing Saudi Arabia. I mean, so as you know, women can drive now. Yeah, I finally let them. It's a big change they drive. But have you seen them try to parallel park? It's like I had to fire all the religious police and rehire them as traffic cops. Ah, jeez. I'll tell you. So Thanksgiving is coming up, and man, you think you have some awkward family dinners. I've got like 30,000 deadbeat cousins. I had to throw some of them in jail just to get here. No, but Wally, it's been a very weird month. You know, it's just a scary, scary time to be a man. Just when you think that...
He's very good, this guy. He's great.
It's like, where is the line? Where is the line? You kill kids in Yemen, nothing. Nope. Kidnap a prime minister? Zilch. Jail some women, behead some guys? Nada, am I right? I feel you. Oh, Tom knows. Tom, I see you there in the crowd, Tom. Tom Friedman, everyone. Great guy. Thank you for coming, Tom. Yeah. Oh, but then you botch the murder of one journalist. Just one! And suddenly everyone's like, whoa, 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 whoa. I know you feel me on this, Vladimir. I see you.
This guy is better than Eddie Murphy. I am delirious.
It's like I brought American movies to Saudi Arabia. Wakanda forever, and now this. Enemies of the people, am I right?
Stealing my material, but it's okay. It's okay. We're not gonna cancel an arms deal over that.
But where is the line? 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 Thank you guys so much. You guys are awesome. Thank you so much. Tip your waitress. Up next, we have Matt Lauer. Thank you guys so much.
Public regime.
That's our show this week. We'll be right here next week. Don't miss it. In the meantime, if you like what you've seen, and I know you do, I know you really do, because it's been awesome, check us out on GZEROmedia.com.